The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant. Part 2, continued. Cassette 8, Side 2. The king was generous with these spoils. Some of the properties he gave, most of them he sold at bargain prices, to minor nobles or major burgesses, merchants or lawyers, who had supported or administered his policies. Cromwell received or bought 6 abbeys with an annual revenue of £2,293. His nephew Sir Richard Cromwell received 7, with an income of £2,552. This was the origin of the fortune that made Richard's great-grandson Oliver a man of substance and influence in the next century. Some of the spoils went to build ships, forts, and ports. Some helped to finance war. Some went into the royal palaces at Westminster, Chelsea, and Hampton Court. Some the king lost at dice. 6 monasteries were returned to the Anglican Church as episcopal sees, and a small sum was assigned to continue the most urgent of the charities formerly provided by the monks and nuns. The new aristocracy created by Henry's gifts and sales became a powerful support to the Tudor throne and a bulwark of economic interest against any Catholic restoration. The old feudal aristocracy had decimated itself. The new one, rooted in commerce and industry, changed the nature of the English nobility from static conservatism to dynamic enterprise, and poured fresh blood and energy into the upper classes of England. This, and the spoils, may have been one source of the Elizabethan exuberance. The effects of the dissolution were complex and interminable. The liberated monks may have shared modestly or not in the increase of England's population from about 2,500,000 in 1485 to some 4 million in 1547. A temporary increase in the unemployed helped to depress the earnings of the lower classes for a generation, and the new landlords proved more grasping than the old. Politically, the effect was to augment still further the power of the monarchy. The Church lost the last stronghold of resistance. Morally, the results were a growth of crime, pauperism, and beggary, and a diminished provision of charity. Over 100 monastic hospitals were closed. A few were rehabilitated by municipal authorities. The sums that fearful or reverent souls had bequeathed to priests as insurance against infernal or purgatorial fire were confiscated in expectation that no harm would come to the dead. 2,374 chantries, with their endowments for masses, were appropriated by the king. The severest effects were in education. The convents had provided schools for girls, the monasteries and the chantry priests had maintained schools and 90 colleges for boys. All these institutions were dissolved. Having stated the facts as impartially as unconscious prejudice allowed, the historian may be permitted to add a confessedly hypothetical comment. Henry's greed and Cromwell's ruthlessness merely advanced by a generation an inevitable lessening in the number and influence of English monasteries. These had once done admirable work in education, charity, and hospital care, but the secularization of such functions was proceeding throughout Western Europe, even where Catholicism prevailed. The decline in religious fervor and other worldliness was rapidly narrowing the flow of novices into conventual establishments, and many of these were reduced to so small a number as seemed out of proportion to the splendor of their buildings and the income of their lands. It is a pity that the situation was met by the brusque haste of Cromwell, rather than by Wolsey's humane and sounder plan of transforming more and more monasteries into colleges. Henry's procedure here, as in his quest for a son, was worse than his aim. It was good that an end should be put in some measure to the exploitation of simple piety by pious fraud. Our chief regrets go to the nuns, who for the most part labored dutifully in prayer, schooling, and benevolence. And even one who cannot share their trustful faith must be grateful that their like again minister with lifelong devotion to the needs of the sick and the poor. 2. The Obstinate Irish, 1300 to 1558. The English kings justified their domination of Ireland on the ground that a hostile continental power might at any moment use that verdant island for a flank attack upon England, and this consideration, seconding the love of power, became more active when Protestant England failed to win Ireland from the Roman Church. The Irish people, heroic and anarchic, virile and violent, poetically gifted and politically immature, resisted every day their subjection to an alien blood and speech. The evils of the English occupation mounted. Under Edward II, many Anglo-Irish landowners returned to England to live there in ease on Irish rents. and though the English Parliament repeatedly denounced this practice, absentee landlordism rose through 3 centuries to be a leading spur to Irish revolts. Englishmen who remained in Ireland tended to marry Irish girls and were gradually absorbed into Irish blood and ways. Anxious to dam this racial drain, the Irish Parliament, dominated by English residence and influence, passed the famous Statute of Kilkenny in 1366, which, along with some wise and generous provisions, forbade intermarriage, fosterage, or other intimate relations between the English and the Irish in Ireland, and any use by the English of Irish speech, customs, or dress on pain of imprisonment and forfeiture of property. No Irishman was henceforth to be received into any English religious organization, and no Irish bards or storytellers were to enter English homes. These prohibitions failed. The roses in Irish cheeks outshone the majesty of the law, and racial fusion went on in that narrow march, border, or pale where alone the English in Ireland dared to dwell. During the Wars of the Roses, Ireland might have expelled the English had the Irish chiefs united, but they preferred fraternal strife, sometimes encouraged thereto by English gold. Henry VII re-established English authority in the Pale, and his Lord Deputy, Sir Edward Poynings, pushed through the Irish Parliament the humiliating Poynings Law of 1494, that in future no Irish Parliament should be convened until all bills to be presented to it had been approved by the King and Privy Council of England. So emasculated, the English government in Ireland became the most incompetent, ruthless, and corrupt in Christendom. Its favourite device was to appoint one of the 60 Irish chieftains as deputy to the viceroy, and commission him to buy or subdue the rest. Gerald, 8th Earl of Kildare, so appointed, made some progress in this direction, and mitigated the inter-tribal lawlessness that helped English exactions to keep Ireland weak and poor. On his death in 1513, his son Gerald Fitzgerald was named to succeed him as deputy. This 9th Earl of Kildare had a career typical of the Irish lords. Accused of conspiring with the Earl of Desmond to let a French force land in Ireland, he was summoned to England and committed to the Tower. On his promise faithfully to aid the English cause, Henry VIII released him and reappointed him deputy. Soon he was charged with maladministration. He was again brought to England and again sent to the Tower, where he died within the year. This in 1534. His devoted son, Silken Thomas Fitzgerald, at once declared war on the English. He fought bravely and recklessly for 14 months, was overcome, and was hanged in 1537. By this time Henry VIII had completed his divorce from the Roman Church. With characteristic audacity, he bade the English Parliament acknowledge him head of the Church in Ireland as well as in England. It did. An oath accepting his ecclesiastical supremacy was required of all governmental officials in Ireland, and all church tithes were henceforth to be paid to the king. Reformers entered the churches in the Pale and demolished religious relics and images. All monasteries, but a remote few, were closed. Their property was taken by the government. Their monks were dismissed with pensions if they made no fuss. Some of the spoils were distributed among the Irish chieftains. So oiled, most of them accepted titles of nobility from the English king, acknowledged his religious supremacy, and abjured the Pope in 1539. The clan system was abolished, and Ireland was declared a kingdom, with Henry as king, in 1541. Henry was victorious but mortal. He died within 5 years of his triumph. Catholicism in Ireland survived. The chieftains took their apostasy as a passing incident in politics. They continued to be Catholics, as Henry did, except for ignoring the Pope, and the priests whose ministrations they supported and received remained quietly orthodox. The faith of the people underwent no change, or rather it took on a new vigor because it maintained the pride of nationality against a schismatic king and, later, a Protestant queen. The struggle for freedom became more intense than before, since now it spoke for body and soul. 3. Every ounce a king. Henry in 1540 was the most absolute monarch that England had ever known. The old Norman nobility, whose ancestors had checked even William the Conqueror, were now timidly obedient and almost forgot the Magna Charta of their prerogatives. The new nobility, enriched by commerce and endowed by the king, served as a barrier to aristocratic or religious revolts. The House of Commons, once the jealous protector of English liberties, but now hand-picked by agents of the king, yielded to him almost unprecedented powers: the right to confiscate property, to name anyone his successor, to determine orthodoxy and heresy, to send men to death after only a mock trial, and to issue proclamations that were to have the authority of Acts of Parliament. In Henry's reign, the English spirit of independence burned low in its socket, and love of freedom grew cold. The English people accepted this absolutism partly through fear, partly because it seemed the alternative to another War of the Roses. Order was more important than liberty. The same alternatives persuaded Englishmen to suffer Henry's ecclesiastical supremacy. With Catholics and Protestants ready to fly at each other's throats, with Catholic citizens, ambassadors, and potentates conspiring against him almost to invasion, Henry believed that order could be secured in the religious life of England only by royal determination of faith and ritual. Implicitly, he accepted the case that the Church had made for authority in religion. He tried to dictate who should read the Bible. When the bishops suppressed Tyndale's translation, he bade them prepare a better one. When they dallied too long, he allowed Cromwell to commission a new translation by Miles Coverdale. This first complete British version appeared in Zurich in 1535. In 1539, a revised edition was printed, and Cromwell ordered this great Bible placed in every English church. Henry, of the royal liberality and goodness, granted the citizens the privilege of reading the Bible in their homes, and soon it became a daily influence in nearly every English family. But it was a fountain of discord as well as of inspiration. Every village sprouted amateur exegetes who proved anything or its opposite by Scripture. Fanatics wrangled over it in churches and came to blows over it in taverns. Some ambitious men gave their wives writs of divorce, or kept 2 wives at once, on the plea that this was sound biblical practice. The king regretted the liberty of reading that he had allowed and reverted to the Catholic stand. In 1543, he induced Parliament to rule that only nobles and property owners might legally possess the Bible, and only priests might preach on it or discuss it publicly. It was difficult for the people, even for the king, to know the king's mind. Catholics continued to go to the stake or the block for denying his ecclesiastical supremacy, Protestants for questioning Catholic theology. Friar Forrest of the observant Franciscans at Greenwich, who refused to disown the Pope, was suspended in chains over a fire and was slowly roasted to death on May 31, 1537. John Lambert, a Protestant, was arrested for denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He was tried by Henry himself, was by Henry condemned to die, and was burned at Smithfield on November 16, 1538. Under the growing influence of Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, Henry veered more and more toward orthodoxy. In 1539, King, Parliament, and Convocation, by the Act of the 6 Articles, proclaimed the Roman Catholic position on the real presence, clerical celibacy, monastic vows, masses for the dead, the necessity of auricular confession to a priest, and the sufficiency of communion in one kind. Whoever, by spoken or written word, denied the real presence should suffer death by burning, without opportunity to abjure, confess, and be absolved. Whoever denied any of the other articles should for the first offense forfeit his property, for the second his life. All marriages hitherto contracted by priests were declared void, and for a priest thereafter to retain his wife was to be a felony. The people, still orthodox, generally approved these articles, but Cromwell did his best to moderate them in practice, and in 1540 the king, tacking again, ordered prosecution under the act to cease. Nevertheless, Bishops Latimer and Shaxton, who disapproved of the articles, were deposed and jailed. On July 30th, 1540, 3 Protestants and 3 Catholic priests suffered death at Smithfield in unwilling unison. The Protestants for questioning some Catholic doctrines, the Catholics for rejecting the ecclesiastical sovereignty of the king. Henry was as forceful in administration as in theology. Though he maintained an extravagant court and spent much time in eating, he toiled heavily in the tasks of government. He chose competent aides as ruthless as himself. He reorganized the army, equipped it with new weapons, and studied the latest fashions in tactics and strategy. He built the first permanent Royal Navy, which cleared the coasts and channel of pirates and prepared for the naval victories of Elizabeth. But he taxed his people to the limit of tolerance, repeatedly debased the currency, confiscated private property on flimsy pretexts, demanded contributions, repudiated his debts, borrowed from the Fuggers, and promoted the English economy in the hope that it would yield him added revenue. Agriculture was in depression. Serfdom was still widespread. Enclosures for sheep pasturage continued, and the new landlords, unhindered by feudal traditions, doubled or quadrupled the rents of their tenants on the ground of rising prices and refused to renew expiring leases. Thousands of dispossessed tenants made their way to London and clamored at the doors of the courts of law for redress which they could not obtain. Catholic Moore drew a pitiful picture of the beggared peasantry, and Protestant Latimer denounced the rent-raiser step-lords, and, like Luther, idealized a Catholic past when men were full of pity and compassion. Parliament laid ferocious penalties upon vagabondage and beggary. By an act of 1530-31, any able-bodied mendicant, whether man or woman, was to be tied to the end of a cart naked and be beaten with whips throughout the town till his body be bloody. For a second offense, an ear was to be cut off. For a third, another ear. In 1536, however, the third offense incurred death. Gradually, the displaced peasants found work in the cities, and poor relief mildly mitigated pauperism. In the end, the productivity of the land was raised by large-scale farming, but the inability of the government to ease the transition was a criminal and heartless failure of statesmanship. The same government protected industry with tariffs, and manufacturers profited from the cheap labor made available by the migrations of peasants to the towns. Capitalistic methods reorganized the textile industry and raised a new class of wealthy men to stand beside the merchants in support of the king. Cloth now replaced wool as England's chief export. Most exports were of necessaries produced by the lower classes. Most imports were of luxuries available only to the rich. Commerce and industry were benefited by a law of 1536 legalizing interest rates of 10%, and the rapid rise of prices favored enterprise while it penalized workers, peasants, and old-style feudal lords. Rents rose 1,000% between 1500 and 1576. Food prices rose 250 to 300%. Wages rose 150%. Such poverty reigneth now, wrote Thomas Starkey about 1537, that in no case may stand with a very true and flourishing commonweal. Guild members found some relief in the insurance, and mutual aid provided them against poverty and fire, but in 1545 Henry confiscated the property of the guilds. 4. The dragon retires. What sort of a man was this ogre of a king? Holbein the Younger, coming to England about 1536, painted portraits of Henry and Jane Seymour. The gorgeous costume almost conceals the royal corpulence. The gems and ermine, the hand on the jeweled sword, reveal the pride of authority, the vanity of the uncontradicted male. The broad, fat face bespeaks a hearty sensualism. The nose is a pillar of strength. The tight lips and stern eyes warn of a despot quick to anger and cold to cruelty. Henry was now 46, at the top of his political curve, but entering physical decline. He was destined to marry thrice again, and yet to have no further progeny. From all his 6 wives he had but 3 children who outlived infancy. One of these 3, Edward VI, was sickly and died at 15. Mary remained desolately barren in marriage. Elizabeth never dared marry, probably through consciousness of some physical impediment. The curse of semi-sterility or bodily defect lay upon the proudest dynasty in English history. Henry's mind was keen, his judgment of men was penetrating, his courage and willpower were immense. His manners were coarse, and his scruples disappeared with his youth. To his friends, however, he remained kind and generous, jovially amiable, and capable of winning affection and devotion. Born to royalty, he was surrounded from birth with obeisance and flattery. Only a few men dared withstand him, and they were buried without their heads. Surely, wrote More from the Tower, it is a great pity that any Christian prince should by a flexible, meaning knee-bending, counsel, ready to follow his affections, meaning desires, and by a weak clergy be with flattery so shamefully abused. This was the external source of Henry's retrogression in character, that the absence of resistance to his will after the death of More made him as flabby in moral sense as in physique. He was not more lax in sex than Francis I, and after the passing of Anne Boleyn he seems to have been more monogamous, seriatim, than Charles V. Sexual looseness was not his worst failing. He was greedy for money as well as for power, and seldom allowed considerations of humanity to halt his appropriations. His ungrateful readiness to kill women whom he had loved, or men who, like More and Cromwell, had served him loyally for many years, is despicable. Yet in result he was not 1/10 as murderous as the well-meaning Charles IX sanctioning the massacre of St. Bartholomew, or Charles V condoning the sack of Rome, or German princes fighting through 30 years for their right to determine the religious beliefs of their subjects. The inner source of his deterioration was the repeated frustration of his will in love and parentage. Long disappointed in his hope for a son, dishonestly checked in his reasonable request for an annulment of his first marriage, Deceived, he believed, by the wife for whom he had risked his throne, bereaved so soon of the only wife who gave him an heir, tricked into marriage by a woman utterly alien to him in language and temperament, cuckolded, he thought, by the wife who seemed to promise him at last the happiness of a home. Here was a king possessing all England, but denied the domestic joys of the simplest husband in his realm. Suffering intermittent agony from an ulcer in his leg, buffeted with revolts and crises throughout his reign, forced at almost every moment to arm against invasion, betrayal, and assassination, how could such a man develop normally, or avoid degeneration into suspicion, craft, and cruelty? And how shall we, who fret at the pinpricks of private tribulation, understand a man who bore in his mind and person the storm and stress of the English Reformation, weaned his people by perilous steps from a deeply rooted loyalty, and yet must have felt in his divided soul an erosive wonder, had he freed a nation or shattered Christendom? Danger, as well as power, was the medium in which he lived. He could never tell how far his enemies would go, or when they would succeed. In 1538 he ordered the arrest of Sir Geoffrey Pole, brother to Reginald. Fearing torture, Geoffrey confessed that he, another brother, Lord Montague, Sir Edward Neville, and the Marquess and Marchioness of Exeter had had treasonable correspondence with the Cardinal. Geoffrey was pardoned. Exeter, Montague, and several others were hanged and quartered between 1538 and 1539. Lady Exeter was imprisoned, and the Countess of Salisbury, mother of the Poles, was placed under guard. When the Cardinal visited Charles V in Toledo in 1539, bearing a futile request from Paul III that the Emperor would join with Francis in outlawing all commerce with England, Henry retaliated by arresting the Countess, who was now 70 years old. Perhaps he hoped that by keeping her in the Tower he could check the Cardinal's enthusiasm for invasion. All was fair in the game of life and death. Having remained for 2 years unmarried, Henry bade Cromwell seek for him a marital alliance that would strengthen his hand against Charles. Cromwell recommended Anne, sister-in-law of the Elector of Saxony and sister of the Duke of Cleves, who was then at odds with the Emperor. Cromwell set his heart on the marriage, by which he hoped ultimately to form a league of Protestant states, and thereby compel Henry to repeal the anti-Lutheran 6 Articles. Henry dispatched Holbein to paint a likeness of the lady. Possibly Cromwell added some instructions to the artist. The picture came, and Henry judged the princess bearable. She looks discouragingly sad in the Holbein portrait that hangs in the Louvre, but not less plain of feature than the Jane Seymour who had for a moment softened the heart of the king. When Anne came in body and Henry laid eyes on her on January 1st, 1540, love died at first sight. He shut his eyes, married her, and prayed again for a son to strengthen the Tudor succession now that Prince Edward was revealing his physical frailty. But he never forgave Cromwell. 4 months later, alleging malfeasance and corruption, he ordered the arrest of his most profitable minister. Hardly anyone objected. Cromwell was the most unpopular subject in England, for his origin, his methods, his venality, his wealth. In the Tower he was required to sign statements impugning the validity of the new marriage. Henry announced that he had not given his inward consent to the union, and had never consummated it. Anne, confessing that she was still a maid, agreed to an annulment in return for a comfortable pension. Loath to face her brother, she chose a lonely life in England, and it was small comfort to her that when she died in 1557, she was buried in Westminster Abbey. Cromwell was beheaded on July 28, 1540. On the same day, Henry married Catherine Howard, 20 years old, of a strictly Catholic house. The Catholic party was gaining. The king ceased to flirt with continental Protestants and made his peace with the Emperor. Feeling himself at least safe in that quarter, he turned his fancy northward in the hope of annexing Scotland and thereby rounding out the geographical boundaries and security of Britain. He was distracted by another rebellion in the north of England. Before leaving to suppress it and to discourage conspiracy at his back, he ordered all the political prisoners in the Tower, including the Countess of Salisbury, to be put to death, this in 1541. The rebellion collapsed, and Henry, distraught with cares, returned to Hampton Court to seek solace from his new queen. The second Catherine was the fairest of his mates. More dependent than before on wifely ministrations, the king learned almost to love her, and he gave thanks to God for the good life he was leading and hoped to lead under her supervision. But on the day after this Te Deum, November 2nd, 1541, Archbishop Cranmer handed him documents indicating that Catherine had had premarital relations with 3 successive suitors. 2 of these confessed, so did the Queen. Henry took such grief, the French ambassador reported, that it was thought he had gone mad. The fear haunted him that God had cursed all his marriages. He was inclined to pardon Catherine, but evidence was given him that she had, since her royal marriage, committed adultery with her cousin. She admitted having received her cousin in her private apartment late at night, but only in the presence of Lady Rochford. She denied any misdeed then or at any time since her marriage, and Lady Rochford testified to the truth of these statements so far as her own knowledge went. But the royal court pronounced the Queen guilty, and on February 13th, 1542, she was beheaded on the same spot where Anne Boleyn's head had fallen 6 years before. Her paramours were sentenced to life imprisonment. The king was now a broken man. His ulcer baffled the medical science of his time, and syphilis, never quite cured, was spreading its ravages through his frame. Losing the zest of life, he'd allowed himself to become an unwieldy mass of flesh, his cheeks overlapping his jaws, his narrow eyes half lost in the convolutions of his face. He could not walk from one room to another without support. Realizing that he had not many years to live, he issued in 1543 a new decree fixing the succession to his throne. First on Edward, then on Mary, then on Elizabeth. He went no further, for next in line was Mary Stuart of Scotland. In a final effort to beget a healthy son, and after repeated urging from his council, he married a sixth wife on July 12, 1543. Catherine Parr had survived 2 previous husbands, but the king no longer insisted on virgins. She was a woman of culture and tact. She nursed her royal invalid patiently, reconciled him with his long-neglected daughter Elizabeth, and tried to soften his theology and his persecuting zeal. Theological bonfires continued to the end of the reign. 26 persons were burned for heresy in its final 8 years. In 1543, spies reported to Bishop Gardiner that Henry Filmer had said, "If God is really present," in the consecrated host, "then in my lifetime I've eaten 20 gods." That Robert Testwood, at the elevation of the host, had jocularly warned the priest not to let God fall, and that Anthony Pearson had called any priest a thief who preached anything but the Word of God, that is, the Scriptures. All these men, by the Anglican bishop's orders, were burned in a meadow before the royal palace at Windsor. The king was disturbed to find that the evidence given by a witness in these cases was perjury. The culprit was sent to the Tower. In 1546, Gardiner condemned 4 more to the stake for denying the real presence. One was a young woman, Anne Askew, who kept to her heresy through 5 hours of questioning. "That which you call your God," she said at her trial, "is a piece of bread. For proof thereof, let it lie in a box 3 months, and it will be mouldy." She was tortured till nearly dead to elicit from her the names of other heretics. She remained silent in her agony and went to her death, she said, "as merry as one that is bound toward heaven." The king was not active in these persecutions, but the victims appealed to him without result. In 1543, he fell into war with Scotland and his beloved brother, Francis I, and soon found himself allied with his old enemy, Charles V. To finance his campaigns, he demanded new loans from his subjects, repudiated payment on the loans of 1542, and confiscated the endowments of the universities. He was carried to the war in person and supervised the siege and capture of Boulogne. His armies invaded Scotland and wrecked the abbeys of Melrose and Dryburgh, and 5 other monasteries, but were routed at Ancre-Moor in 1545. A profitable accord was signed with France in 1546, and the king could die in peace. He was now so weak that noble families openly contended as to which should have the regency for young Edward. A poet, the Earl of Surrey, was so confident that his father, the Duke of York, would be regent that he adopted a coat of arms suitable only to an heir apparent to the throne. Henry arrested both. They confessed their guilt. The poet was beheaded on January 9, 1547, and the Duke was scheduled for execution soon after the 27th. But on the 28th the king died. He was 55 years old, but he had lived a dozen lives in one. He left a large sum to pay for masses for the repose of his soul. The 37 years of his reign transformed England more deeply than perhaps he imagined or desired. He thought to replace the Pope while leaving unchanged the old faith that had habituated the people to moral restraints and obedience to law. But his successful defiance of the papacy, his swift dispersal of monks and relics, his repeated humiliation of the clergy, his appropriation of church property, and his secularization of the government so weakened ecclesiastical prestige and authority as to invite the theological changes that followed in the reigns of Edward and Elizabeth. The English Reformation was less doctrinal than the German, but one outstanding result was the same: the victory of the state over the church. The people escaped from an infallible pope into the arms of an absolute king. In a material sense they had not benefited. They paid church tithes as before, but the net surplus went to the government. Many peasants now tilled their tenancies for step-lords more ruthless than the abbots whom Carlyle was to idealize in past and present. William Cobbett thought that, viewed merely in its social aspect, the English Reformation was in reality the rising of the rich against the poor. Records of prices and wages indicate that the agricultural and town workers were better off at Henry's accession than at his death. The moral aspects of the reign were bad. The king gave the nation a demoralizing example in his sexual indulgence, his callous passing in a few days from the execution of one wife to the bed of the next, his calm cruelty, fiscal dishonesty, and material greed. The upper classes disordered the court and government with corrupt intrigues. The gentry emulated Henry in grasping at the wealth of the church. The industrialists mulcted their workers and were mulcted by the king. The decay of charity did not complete the picture, for there remained the debasing subserviency of a terrified people to a selfish autocrat. Only the courage of the Protestant and Catholic martyrs redeemed the scene, and Fisher and More, the noblest of them, had persecuted in their turn. In a large perspective, even those bitter years bore some good fruit. The Reformation had to be. We must repeatedly remind ourselves of this while we record the deviltry of the century that gave it birth. The break with the past was violent and painful, but only a brutal blow could shake its grip on the minds of men. When that incubus was removed, the spirit of nationalism, which at first permitted despotism, became a popular enthusiasm and a creative force. The elimination of the papacy from English affairs left the people for a time at the mercy of the state, but in the long run it compelled them to rely on themselves in checking their rulers and claiming, decade after decade, a measure of freedom commensurate with their intelligence. The government would not always be as powerful as under Henry the Terrible. It would be weak under a sickly son and an embittered daughter. Then, under a vacillating but triumphant queen, the nation would rise in a burst of liberated energy and lift itself to the leadership of the European mind. Perhaps Elizabeth and Shakespeare could not have been, had not England been set free by her worst and strongest king. Chapter 26. Edward VI and Mary Tudor, 1547 to 1548. 1. The Somerset Protectorate, 1547 to 1549. The 10-year-old boy who succeeded to the throne of England as Edward VI had been painted by Holbein 4 years before in one of the most appealing of all portraits. Feathered beret, red hair, ermine-collared robe, and a face of such gentleness and wistful delicacy that we should imagine him to be all Jane Seymour, nothing of Henry VIII. Perhaps he inherited the physical frailty that had made her life his ransom. He never gained the strength to rule. Yet he took in noble earnest the obligations falling to him as prince or king, zealously studied languages, geography, government, and war, kept close watch on all affairs of state that were allowed to come under his ken, and showed to all except nonconforming Catholics so much kindness and goodwill that England thought it had buried an ogre to crown a saint. Educated by Cranmer, he had become an ardent Protestant. He discouraged any severe punishment for heresy, but was unwilling to let his Catholic half-sister Mary hear Mass, for he sincerely believed the Mass to be the most blasphemous idolatry. He accepted gladly the decision of the Royal Council that chose as regent for him his uncle Edward Seymour, soon made Duke of Somerset, who favored a Protestant policy. Somerset was a man of intelligence, courage, and integrity, imperfect but in his time outstanding. Handsome, courteous, generous, he shamed by his life the cowardly and self-seeking aristocracy that could forgive him everything but his sympathy for the poor. Though almost absolute in power, he ended the absolutism established by Henry VII and VIII, allowed much greater freedom of speech, reduced the number of actions previously classed as treason or felony, required sounder evidence for conviction, returned their dowries to the widows of condemned men, and repealed the more oppressive laws of the preceding reign concerning religion. The king remained head of the English Church, and to speak irreverently of the Eucharist was still a punishable offense, but the same statute ordered the sacrament to be administered in both kinds, prescribed English as the language of the service, and repudiated purgatory and masses for the dead. English Protestants who had fled from England returned with the pollen of Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin on them, and foreign reformers, scenting the new freedom, brought their diverse gospels to the troubled isle. Peter Martyr Vermigli and Martin Butzer came from Strasbourg, Bernardino Ochino from Augsburg, Jan Lasky from Emden. Anabaptists and Unitarians crossed the Channel to preach in England heresies that shocked Protestants as much as Catholics. Iconoclast crowds in London removed crucifixes, paintings, and statues from the churches. Nicholas Ridley, principal of Pembroke College, Cambridge, preached powerfully against religious images and holy water. And to cap it all, Archbishop Cranmer did eat meat openly in Lent, the like of which was never seen since England was a Christian country. The Royal Council thought this was going too far, but Somerset overruled it and gave reform its head. Under his lead, Parliament in 1547 ordered that every picture on church wall or window commemorating a prophet, apostle, or saint should be extirpated so that there should remain no memory of the same. Most of the stained glass in the churches was destroyed. Most of the statues were crushed. Crucifixes were replaced with the royal arms. Whitewashed walls and stainless windows took the color out of the religion of England. There was a general scramble in each locality for church silver and gold, and in 1551 the government appropriated what remained. The magnificent medieval cathedrals barely remained. The leading spirit in these changes was Archbishop Cranmer. Their leading opponents were Edmund Bonner, Bishop of London, and Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester. Cranmer had them sent to the Fleet, a London jail so named from its proximity to the Fleet stream, an estuary, now covered, of the Thames. Meanwhile, the Archbishop had been working for years on an attempt to provide in one book a substitute for both the Missal and the Breviary of the defeated Church. Peter Martyr and other scholars helped him, but this first Book of Common Prayer in 1548 was essentially Cranmer's personal product, in which zeal for the new faith merged with a fine sense for solemn beauty in feeling and phrase. Even his translations from the Latin had the spell of genius on them. The book was not quite revolutionary. It followed some Lutheran leads, as in rejecting the sacrificial character of the Mass, but it neither denied nor affirmed transubstantiation. It retained much Catholic ritual and could be accepted by not too precise a Romanist. Cranmer submitted it not to Convocation but to Parliament, and that laic body had no qualms of jurisdiction in prescribing religious ritual and belief. The book was made law of the realm, and every church in England was ordered to adopt it. Bonner and Gardiner, who were released from jail in a general amnesty in 1549, were re-imprisoned when they rejected the right of Parliament to legislate on religion. Princess Mary was allowed to hear Mass in the privacy of her chambers. A dangerous international situation quieted for a time the violent debate between Catholics and Protestants. Henry II of France demanded the evacuation of Boulogne. Refused, he prepared to besiege it, and at any moment Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, then a girl of 5 in France, might bring Scotland into the war. Learning that the Scots were arming and were stirring up rebellion in Ireland, Somerset led a force across the border and defeated them at Pinkie Cleugh on September 10, 1547. The terms that he offered to the Scots were remarkably generous and far-seeing. The Scots were not to suffer any forfeiture of liberty or property. Scotland and England were to be merged into one empire of Great Britain. Each nation was to have self-government under its own laws, but both were to be ruled, after the current reign, by the offspring of the Queen of Scots. This was precisely the union effected in 1603, except that it would have facilitated a restoration of Catholicism in England and its continuance in Scotland. The Catholics of Scotland rejected the plan for fear that English Protestantism would infect their own land. Besides, Scottish nobles were receiving pensions from the French government and thought a lever in the hand worth £2 in the bush. Frustrated in seeking peace, facing war with France, struggling to establish a compromise among uncompromising faiths at home, and hearing renewed noises of agrarian revolt in England, Somerset drank the cup of power to the dregs when his own brother plotted to overthrow him. Thomas Seymour was not content to be Lord High Admiral and member of the Privy Council. He would be king. He wooed Princess Mary, then Princess Elizabeth, but in vain. He received money stolen from the mint and spoils from the pirates whom he allowed in the Channel, and so financed he gathered secret stores of arms and ammunition. His conspiracy was discovered. He was accused by the Earls of Warwick and Southampton. He was almost unanimously condemned by both Houses of Parliament, and on March 20th, 1549, he was put to death. Somerset tried to protect him, but failed, and the protector's prestige fell with his brother's head. Somerset's ruin was completed by Kett's Rebellion. That uprising illustrated the apparent anomaly that whereas in Germany the peasant revolt was Protestant, in England it was Catholic. In each case, religion was a front for economic discontent, and in England the front was Catholic because the government was now Protestant. In the experience of the agricultural poor, wrote the Protestant Froude, an increase of personal suffering was the chief result of the Reformation. It is to the credit of Protestant divines in this reign, Cranmer, Latimer, Lever, Crowley, that they condemned the sharpened exploitation of the peasantry, and Somerset with hot indignation denounced the merciless exactions of new landowners sprung from the dunghill of city wealth. Parliament could think of no wiser remedies than to pass ferocious laws against beggary and instruct the churches to take up weekly a collection for the poor. Somerset sent out a commission to get the facts about enclosures and high rents. It met with subtle or open resistance from the landlords. Tenants were terrified into concealing their wrongs, and the modest recommendations of the commission were rejected by the Parliament, in which the agricultural districts were represented by landowning gentry. Somerset opened a private court in his own house to hear the complaints of the poor. More and more nobles, led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, joined in a movement to depose him. But now the peasants, furious with accumulated wrongs and frustrated suits for redress, burst into revolt from one end of England to the other. Somersetshire rose first, then Wilts and Gloucestershire, Dorset and Hampshire, Berks and Oxford and Buckingham, in the west Cornwall and Devon, in the east Norfolk and Kent. At Norwich, a minor landlord, Robert Kett, organized the rebels, seized the municipal government, and set up a peasant commune that for a month ruled the town and its hinterland. On Mousehold Hill, north of the city, Kett encamped 16,000 men, and there, under an oak tree, he sat daily in judgment upon offending landlords arrested by the peasants. He was not bloodthirsty. Those whom he condemned were imprisoned and fed. But of property rights and title deeds he made small account. He bade his men scour the surrounding country, force entry into the manor houses, confiscate all weapons, and corral for the commune all cattle and provisions wherever found. Sheep, chief rivals of the peasants for the use of the soil, were rounded up to the number of 20,000 and were incontinently consumed, along with infinite beeves, swans, hinds, ducks, venison, and pigs. Amid this feasting, Kett nevertheless maintained remarkable order, even allowing preachers to exhort the men to abandon the revolt. Somerset felt much sympathy with the rebels, but agreed with Warwick that they must be dispersed lest the whole economic structure of English life should be overturned. Warwick was sent against them with an army recently raised to fight in France. He offered the rebels a general pardon if they would return to their homes. Kett favored acceptance, but hotter heads were for judgment by battle, and Kett yielded to them. On August 17, 1549, the issue was decided. Warwick's superior tactics won. 3,500 of the rebels were cut down, but when the remnant surrendered, Warwick contented himself with 9 hangings, and sent Kett and a brother to prison in London. News of the defeat took the heart out of the other rebel groups. One after another laid down its arms on promise of amnesty. Somerset used his influence to have most of the leaders released, and the Kett brothers for a while survived. The Protector was accused of having encouraged the revolt by his outspoken sympathy with the poor. This book is continued on Cassette 9, Side 1.